imieniu Muzeum Historii Żydów Polskich witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na tym dzisiejszym wykładzie profesora Hanocha Gutfreunda. Profesor Gutfreund jest izraelskim fizykiem, autorem wielu ważnych publikacji z zakresu mechaniki, fizyki, materii skondensowanej i neurologii obliczeniowej. Profesor urodził się w Krakowie, ale rodzina profesora Gutfreunda pochodzi z Nowego Targu, z którym czuje się związany. II wojnę światową pan profesor Gutfreund przetrwał jako dziecko w Związku Radzieckim i krótko po wojnie wyjechał do Izraela. Przez niemal całe życie naukowe związany był ze swoją alma mater, czyli z Uniwersytetem Hebrajskim w Jerozolimie, gdzie pełnił wiele ważnych funkcji, między innymi dyrektora Instytutu Fizyki, Instytutu Studiów Zaawansowanych, a także w latach 90. rektora i prezydenta tej uczelni. Profesor Gutfreund jest też opiekunem archiwum i spuścizny intelektualnej po Albercie Einsteinie, zapisanej w testamencie przez tego wielkiego naukowca właśnie Uniwersytetowi Hebrajskiemu. I postać Einsteina jest punktem odniesienia w dzisiejszym wykładzie profesora Gutfreunda, który zgodził się wystąpić w Muzeum Historii Żydów Polskich przy okazji pobytu w Warszawie, pobytu organizowanego przez Polską Akademię Nauk. Na końcu, ale jest to bardzo ważna wiadomość, że profesor jest wielkim przyjacielem naszego muzeum w Izraelu. Przez wiele lat był przewodniczącym Komitetu Wsparcia Budowy Muzeum Historii Żydów Polskich w Izraelu. Uczestniczył także w ubiegłym roku w uroczystościach otwarcia naszej instytucji. Z tym większą radością witamy pana profesora na tym dzisiejszym wykładzie i oddaję już głos. Zapraszam.
Nie. To już funkcjonuje, tak? To dobry wieczór Państwu. Jest mi bardzo przykro, że nie jestem w stanie wygłosić tego wykładu po polsku. Ja troszkę jeszcze, ja rozumiem i trochę mówię po polsku, może troszkę więcej jak trochę. I to wszystko dzięki temu, że moi rodzice do końca ich życia między sobą mówili po polsku. Ale niestety nigdy między sobą nie mówili o teorii względności. Te słowa mi brakują, ale już od dawna, dopiero niedawno się dowiedziałem, że teoria względności to theory of relativity. I skąd to wiem? Bo słucham ostatnio na YouTube te wykłady takiego profesora Łukasza Turskiego, księdza profesora Michała Hellera, profesora Trautmana, profesora Wróblewskiego i polecam te wykłady. And now we go to our topic. So you see what the topic is, and let me just see how it works so that there will be no problem. All right, the question of the relations between Albert Einstein and Polish physics, Polish physicists, has been of interest here. Has been of interest, and specifically, there is a study by Professor Bronisław Średniawa, who is not with us anymore, who made a survey of such scientific and personal contacts of Polish physicists with Einstein. I shall talk today only about these three, Leopold Infeld, Ludwikiem Silbersteinem. They are not the only Jewish physicists on the list, but you will understand why I chose specifically to focus on those. Now, Professor Średniawa has also published a study on the reception of relativity in Poland. And this is, again, an exciting, a unique story. Had I talked to you about that, I would have to mention not only this, I would have to mention also August Witkowski and Stanisław Loria, who were among the first in the world, not only in Poland, to recognize the significance and importance of the special theory of relativity. You see, outside of Poland, everybody knows that Max Planck, the great champion of physics, together with Einstein, they are the uncontested champions of the transition from classical to modern physics, that Planck was the first. But at the same time, Witkowski and Loria recognize the importance of relativity. I would have to also to mention Jakub Laub, who published a few papers with Einstein on the special theory of relativity, who is Jewish also. I would have to mention Władysław Nathanson, from whom Infeld heard first lectures on relativity, and certainly Jan Weissenhoff from Vilna and later from Krakow, and I shall mention him again. So these are my three heroes of today. And so, as you have already heard, the Hebrew University is privileged to own the Albert Einstein archives, 80,000 documents, and for the last few years, I have been privileged to be the custodian of that immense treasure of culture. And here you see, so this is Leopold Infeld, and this is the correspondence, and we have 68 letters from E to I, and so on, and I'm going to show you that statistics, and these are my three heroes. Here you see how many letters we have of them. To prepare this talk, I read the whole correspondence. Each one of the three is a unique character. Each one of the three, first of all, is a very able scientist, very intelligent, very clever. This should be remembered. Silberstein was a little forgotten. He made more mistakes than all the others, but I'll show to you that his contribution, in spite of all his mistakes, should not be underestimated. So before, you see, I chose these three because the correspondence and the contacts are in the 20th and 30s. And that is the time where the general theory of relativity is already established, and the whole challenge is to understand what this general theory of relativity means. What is hidden in those complicated equations, which I'm going to show you. And what are the consequences for cosmology? And it is on this scientific arena that these three interact with Einstein. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit in what state in his life was Einstein in those years. So let me tell you, in 1905, the miraculous year, Einstein is 26. He is not working at a university because he couldn't get a job. He is working in the patent office in Bern. He has a baby sitting in his lap. Everything that he does in free time. And in that year, in 1 year, he has revolutionized physics. He has resolved all the problems, all the dilemmas that were on the agenda of classical physics. And I'm not going even to mention what happened in 1905. All I am going to tell you that in that year, he has modified our understanding of space and time and formulated the special theory of relativity. And now, for the next 15 years, for the next 15 minutes, you are going to be my students in physics. Next 15 minutes is a lecture in physics. Okay? Bear with me. Afterwards, it will again be maybe more anecdotal. So what is this special theory of relativity? So the special theory of relativity, I am not very consistent. Some of my slides are in Polish, some of my slides are in English, some will be mixed. So this is the special theory of relativity. It depends on two assumptions. One is the the relativity principle. And let me explain you what that means, and I'm explaining it the way Einstein metaphorically explained it. Now imagine yourself that you are sitting on a train, and the windows are closed, and the tracks are smoothed so that you don't hear anything. And the train may move relatively to the platform, but at constant velocity. That's very important, at constant velocity. Then I tell you, and this is what this says, there is nothing you can do, no experiment you can do that will tell you if the train left the platform or is still standing there. So this is one. The second principle, the second assumption which Einstein made is the assumption of the constancy of the velocity of light. Now, why is it such a profound idea here? You see, when you are at an airport, in an airport, and you watch somebody walking on these walking belts, and you ask me, at what velocity does that person walk? This is a meaningless question. Because if I am with him on the belt, as with respect to me, there is no velocity. And then it depends where I am. And everybody thought that the velocity of light should behave like that also. And people tried to detect it unsuccessfully. And nobody dared. Nobody had the chutzpah, is a Polish word, or chutzpah? Nobody had the chutzpah. Like this young, uncommitted man who had no respect for authority, to assume, no, the velocity of light is different. Light is not like everything else. Now, if you make these two assumptions, from this, everything follows. And what follows first is that if two observers, one on the platform and one on the train, measure the length of the same rod, they will not agree on the result. If two such observers look at a clock, they will not agree on the time. They will also disagree on the order of events. But then, the next result is this one. You see, this combination of 5 symbols, E equal MC2, is the most famous formula. It has become a cultural object. Most people don't understand it. What does it mean? Mass can be converted to energy. C is the velocity of light. The velocity of light is a huge number. A huge number squared is even a huger number. So that means that a small amount of mass can be converted to a huge amount of energy, and this is why you can have atomic bombs if you want, and this is why you can have nuclear reactors if you want, and this explains what happens in the middle, in the core of the sun. This is the source of the energy of the sun, and therefore, directly and indirectly, this is the source of life on Earth. And this, you see, this has been perceived by this clever caricaturist as the summit of human evolution. And EXMC squared is everywhere. Is on ties and shirts and coins, and it is everywhere. And you see, Albert Einstein bequeathed to the Hebrew University not only his papers, but also his rights. So if you want to produce something like this and to sell it, you pay us royalties. Understood? So this is it. But this E equals MC squared has also acquired a divine significance. Okay. So this is this. Now you know everything you should know about the special theory of relativity. Now we go to the next step. So the next step, why did Einstein think that this is not enough? Why did he think that this is not enough is the following. That the special theory talks only about constant motion, constant velocity. Acceleration is excluded. There is no room in the special theory of relativity for gravitation. Therefore, Einstein thought that one should generalize. Now, I want to tell you, everything that he did in 1905, if not for Einstein, would have been done. Not by one person, not by 1 year. It would have been done because it was on the agenda of physics. There was nothing in the world of physics, no observation, no experiment, which called for this generalization. But Einstein was convinced that that's what the world should look like. And it took him 8 years from the moment he started on this intellectual odyssey. It took him 8 years of hard work. And in those 8 years, until he reached this general theory, he made every possible mistake that you can think about. Mistakes of interpretation, mistakes of wrong directions and wrong beginnings, and occasionally even mistakes in calculations, until the end. So what is this general theory of relativity? This general theory of relativity, in November 1915, in this theory, yes, all these reference frames, constant velocity, have to be equivalent. What that means? Follow the words. Now, in this theory, and that is the most important, the difficult feature of this theory. In this theory, the force of gravitation is not a force. It is a geometrical property of space. But one usually, for the physicists here, I also put not only space, but space-time, because we are doing the four-dimensional space-time. And the thing is, you imagine something like that. Here you have masses, and suppose the masses sit on a trampoline, on a two-dimensional trampoline, then of course they curve the trampoline. Now, if you roll a marble on that trampoline, that marble will do all kinds of motions in that thing. So you can visualize curved space of a surface of 2 dimensions. No way to visualize in 4 dimensions. For that, we need mathematics. And I'll show you the mathematics. And the general theory of relativity can be described as there are 2 parts there. How the masses curve space, and then how in curved space particle moves. It is very important that you remember this. I tell you why in a minute, so that you do not anticipate. You see, the way it is formulated, there are 2 parts here. To find the space, namely an equation, a part that tells, this is called the equation of gravitation, and an equation of motion. All the work, the interaction between Einstein and Infeldem and Mathissonem has to do exactly with this problem of motion, where the challenge and the question is if you can derive the motion also from the gravitation. So this is a great challenge. This is what they were interested in. Einstein was interested in that, Infeldem was interested in that, Mathissonem was interested in that. Silberstein, we talked that is something else. So this is this, and now you need the mathematics. So now I do with you something else. You see, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you a mathematical equation, and I am doing it not in order to scare you, but in order to make a point. So this what is here is an equation, it's a shorthand. If you want to do something, you have to have the full equation. So I am going to show you that equation. Yeah, look at this. Don't be scared, relax, breathe. you see, I have put it in a frame, like you frame a picture. So think about it as a modern art picture. You do not understand modern art, you do not understand this, okay? Now, Einstein talked about this equation in terms of beauty. For him, it was aesthetic. For him, it was simple and beautiful. Now, everything that happened in those 20s, 30s between Einstein and the debate, the controversy with Silberstein, everything has to do with solutions of this equation. One can say with confidence that even today, this equation still holds secrets which we have not yet discovered. Phenomena which we have not yet discovered. So this is this equation. And now, from this equation, there is a prediction that light rays are bent by the sun. When they are in the neighborhood of the sun, there is a small angle. In 1919, it was confirmed by observations. And then, this was sensation. New York Times, London Times, look at the headlines, and people say that Einstein overnight became a world celebrity, a superstar. If you think about Michael Jackson, about Madonna, about Elvis Presley, take the three of them together in one person, that is what Einstein became overnight. I'll tell you later what he did with that fame immediately. He joined the Zionist movement, but that will be another story. But it will be mentioned because it's important. It's part of this story. So then, still, we talked about reception of gravity. In Germany, there was a very strong movement against the theory of relativity and against Einstein with a very strong anti-Semitic element. Nothing of that in Poland. That is something that we should emphasize, because if anything, in Poland was one of the smoothest processes of reception of relativity. There may have been anti-Semitism, but not connected with this at all. So how did Einstein react to that? Einstein, when he, according to his own testimony, there was no Jewish sentiment in him before 1914, when he came to Germany and for the first time encountered anti-Semitism. And then he developed a strong Jewish identity, and he was attacked. There was this booklet, Where Does It Lead? And this booklet is a defense of common sense against Einstein assaults. And there was this booklet of hundreds, of 100 authors against Einstein, to which he responded, if I would be wrong, then one would be enough. You don't need 100. But the most severe, the strongest, the brutal, is this by a Nobel laureate, German Nobel laureate, Deutsche Physik, German physics. And German physics is opposed to Jewish physics. And what is written here, the Jew, Albert Einstein, I have translated it in English, the pure-blooded Jew Einstein, his theory of relativity aimed to reform and dominate physics as a whole. They probably never, ever tried to be true. The Jew, yes, is lacking the understanding of truth, in contrast to the unrestrained concern, desire for truth of the Aryan researchers. And then his reaction is that he is involved in more and more Jewish affairs, and here he appears in a meeting of Jewish students in Berlin, and here he plays in a synagogue in Berlin, philanthropic, and mind you, don't be mistaken, as far as I know, this is the only time in his life that he has a kippah on his head. So, and you see something like that also. He stands up, and I am a Jew and proud of it, and he talks about his perception of Judaism. Now, he stood up against anti-Semitism. in Germany, particularly after World War I, Jews were persecuted as the scapegoat for the defeat of Germany, and particularly Jews from Eastern Europe. Ostjuden, that was a term. And they were also discriminated against by the Jewish community. And Einstein stood up against that. And you see, you can hear Leopoldem Infeldem in his autobiography. He talks about his Berlin experience when he was there in 1920, and he mentioned that in Poland I was a Jew, not a Pole, but here in Germany I was a Pole. But what is interesting is this one. I learned about the superior attitude of German Jews to any other Jew in the world, especially Polish Jews. So that, and it is against that Einstein stood up. And you see, I interpret the very close, the immediate affinity between Einstein and Infeld and Mathisson connected with this. Even before he knew how brilliant they were, because they were brilliant, he already embraced them. He already went out of his way to help them, to write letters of recommendation, to pave their way. Now, let us begin with, now we begin the, so this is Myronem Mathisson. He was born in Warsaw. He knew 5 languages perfectly. He knew Hebrew. He made his living by teaching Hebrew, a poorly paid job. That shows that he had Jewish education. He studied. His first paper he wrote his first paper in 1925. Professor, the only theoretical physicist in Warsaw at that time, Bałobrzewski, yes, wanted to give him a PhD, but he was unhappy with that. He was very self-critical, so he disposed of that paper and went to Palestine, and probably got a malaria and had to come back. And then, in 1929, he wrote another paper on this problem of motion, and he wrote an 11-page letter to Einstein, and the letter is in French, and I'm showing you the letter. It's perfect French, but it is beautiful, beautiful calligraphy. And in that letter, he has the chutzpah, the courage, to criticize for the first time. He doesn't have a single paper published yet. He doesn't have a PhD. He criticizes Einstein on his paper. And in that paper, at the end of that paper, you find a phrase like this: jakie trudne jest tu życie dla człowieka mojej rasy. Tutaj błoto stworzone jest z naszych łez. And this is a theme which appears almost in every letter of him. And in the same letter, he also writes there, I would have written you in Hebrew had I known that it will be convenient, that it will be satisfactory for you. So he did not write to him in Hebrew. But then there is a letter, the third letter, where you see there is something in Hebrew here. And what is written here in Hebrew? What is written in Hebrew here, Lama yomru hagoyim ayena Eloheichem. And this is a phrase from Psalm 79, phrase 10. And what does it mean? Nasze czas na triumf względności, dlaczego mają mówić poganie, gdzie jest ich Bóg? He distorted it a little, but that's another story. You see, the whole chapter there is a prayer to God to stand up and defend his nation so that all the nations in the world will know that God is with us. But now Mathisson says, if you publish your theory of relativity, this is the metaphor of God. But this is not such a stupid idea, because it's very compatible with Einstein's idea of Deus sive natura of Spinoza, God is nature. I mentioned at the beginning a lecture by Ksiądz Professor Heller. In one of the lectures I heard, somebody asked him if God knows mathematics. And Professor Heller answered, no, God does not know mathematics because he is mathematics. So you see, so that is the same and the whole idea. And here I am showing you a few highlights in his life. We shall go over it quickly. Einstein really tries to get a scholarship for him in Rockefeller. He doesn't succeed. Mathisson is very disappointed. He wanted to be, he wanted to be in Berlin in order to get closer to Palestine. But then he realized in Poland there is no room for people of my nationality. He's a very able mathematician. Jacques Hadamard, one of the great classical mathematicians, invites him. He spends 2 years in Paris. Einstein sends him an invitation, come to Princeton and work with me on the theory of, on the problem of motion. In the meantime, he goes to the university in Kazan in Russia, has a position there. He writes to Einstein, I cannot leave Kazan before that. But in the meantime, Einstein wants something. So in the meantime, he invites Infeld. So this is a coincidence here. Had Mathisson been there and received the letter in time, he received it 8 months later, he would go to Princeton and not Infeld. But that's how it happened. And then he works in Krakow, and he's a tragic figure. He dies of tuberculosis. And now let's go to my, And now let's go to my main hero. Obviously, the closest, the most continuous interaction between Einstein and one of the three is with Infeld. And this is in 1998, there was here a conference, Infeld's centennial, 100th anniversary of his birth. The most prominent people from the whole world of physics came to honor Infeld, and some of the colleagues who are sitting here yesterday told me the experience of that conference. So let me briefly, again, a few highlights about Infeld. He was born in Kazimierz. He had a religious education, a really religious, pious education. In 1921, he received his PhD, but he could not get a position at a university. And for 8 years, he taught in Jewish high schools. And in 1930, he became a docent at Lvov University. In 1935, there was a recommendation to grant him, a recommendation supported by Piłsudski himself, to grant him a fellowship, but it didn't work through. And then, to his luck, Einstein invited him to Princeton, and there the most famous publication in physics of Infeld is this paper on the problem of motion, and you already know what the problem of motion is. Then he became a professor at University of Toronto. 1950, he returns to Poland. You see, this is his personal luck, but it is also the luck of Polish physics, that in 1935, that fellowship was not granted to him. Had he stayed here, he might have perished as his entire family perished. For Poland, when he came in 1950, he became the founding father of post-war theoretical physics in Poland, and that is not a trifle. Now, in general circles, Infeld is most known for this book, Ewolucja Fizyki. He was a remarkable teacher. I mean, people who remember him talk about his methods of teaching, challenging students, arguing with students. Nothing like that was known in this country before. He is a missionary of science. The word popularizing science, it's not the correct word. It's not popularizing. These books are very deep, but they're accessible. And they're masterpieces, all of them. This one. Before that, he wrote a book to which Einstein wrote an introduction on new methods in physics. He also wrote a book about the mathematician Galois, and so on and so on. So this is this aspect of Infeld. And now I want to mention one episode at the Hebrew University, because in the 30s, the Hebrew University was looking to fill a chair in theoretical physics. Infeld and Mathissonem were considered at the same time. And Einstein was always consulted, because he was a member, he was one of the founders. So Einstein wrote a letter to the university. First of all, he praises both of them. Mathissonem is very original, and Infeld has been working successfully in different fields of theoretical physics, while Mr. Mathissonem has focused his work. And in spite of the fact that my high esteem of Mr. Mathissonem is not lower, I am convinced that under the present circumstances, the university should prefer Infeld. In that letter, he also makes a remark, and his wife is Jewish. And the university tells Einstein, that are considering Infeld, even though received new recommendation about Mathissonem. Now, the new recommendation about Mathissonem is a little bit of enigma. This is the new recommendation about Mathissonem. It's in the archive of the university. You cannot read, most of you cannot read the text. We don't know who is signed here, the first letter, Aleph. We don't know who he is. But that person knows a lot. Knows a lot about Mathissonem, about university. That person argues with Einstein that he does not agree with his recommendation. Mathissonem is very broad, could give lectures on every subject in theoretical physics, and urges the university to accept him. But finally, neither he nor he went to the Hebrew University. This was another victim of fascism in those days. That was somebody, an Italian Jew, who was fired by the Mussolini regime, Giulio Racah, and it was for him to be the founding father of theoretical physics in Israel. So now we go to our third person, Silberstein. Now, Silberstein is a character. He's very different from all of them. He emigrated, I told you already, he emigrated at an early age. He, over the years, attempted to show that the general theory of relativity is wrong. And therefore, he deserves the status of advocatus diaboli, the devil's advocate. In 1911, he published an alternative mathematical formulation, which is okay. Then in 1918, he published a different, wrong version of the general theory of relativity. For the physicists here, just I mentioned a theory of relativity without the equivalence principle. He criticized that observation of the bending of light. He criticized it. He said it doesn't say anything, it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't confirm anything. And in between 33 and 36, there is prolonged, intense debate and controversy with Einstein on the two-body problem. And it is a very elegant thing. So let me, in 2 sentences, try to explain to you what the debate was about. Because in this field equation, on this field, in general relativity, you remember everything is space. So wherever there is a mass or a particle, there is a special point in space, which we call a singular point, but that's a special point. Silberstein found solutions in which you have 2 such special points, and that solution doesn't change with time. So you see, this cannot be, because 2 particles have to attract each other, and therefore it has to change with time. So it is obviously he did something wrong. Einstein was sure that Silberstein made a mistake. So he sends it to Einstein, and Einstein shows him what is wrong. But Einstein made a mistake in his argument. And Silberstein found it. So Einstein finds another way to argue, and he makes another mistake. And then Silberstein, of course, it's a feast for him. And then Einstein is very angry and stops answering, and then there are 2, 3 very nasty letters from Silberstein. I thought you are an honest man. I thought you disappointed me. You avoid discussion. You are not open-minded. And then, so Einstein sits down with a colleague, and they get it right, and Silberstein sends a letter of apology. But despite this, there is a very long correspondence, a very friendly correspondence between Silberstein and Einstein. And the gems of this correspondence are not specifically the scientific ones. And I show you 3 such things. Yeah, because they are, and that will be the end of this story. So the first thing is, there is a letter. You see, Silberstein worked with Max Planck. I mentioned to you Max Planck already. And Silberstein writes to Einstein, is it true that Max Planck has publicly and insistently supported Hitler? It's true and not true. It's not true that he jubilated about Hitler. It is true that he tried to save all the institutions of which he was head, and he put them at the service of the Nazi regime. And Einstein responds to that with a quote that is very well known, especially in German treatments of this. And Einstein says about Planck, he tried hard to soften where he could, and he did not compromise in his acts and words. In spite of that, even if I were a goy, would not remain the president of the Academy. In the same letter, Silberstein urges, it is 1934, it's long before the Holocaust, but there are already victims of the regime. There are refugees. Silberstein urges Einstein to join a group, a consortium, to help victims and to deplore the acts of the Nazis. And to that Einstein responds, naively maybe, he says, no, we Jews should not lead the struggle against the Nazis because that weakens our cause. Because everybody knows that we have an interest. This should be led by others, not us. And this irritates Silberstein. Was a very passionate man. He was not a pleasant character. He could burst out. And then he writes, this is 1 page of a letter, which is a little lunatic, this letter. Notice that this letter, from 1 sentence is in German, yeah? The other one, you say that Jews, it means myself, should not take part in opposing that, and then it goes to German again, and he is furious. But I'm showing that to you because this depicts the character. And finally, one last thing that I want to show you about Silberstein is, it is already after the war, 1945, and he read an article by Einstein promoting peace and deploring warmongers and ultra-capitalists who gain from war, and he is happy with that. So he writes to Einstein this letter, and this letter with the notes that he heard after he read this letter, and last night he heard this concert, Handel's Messiah, and he gives the notes here. And here he says that a girl soprano sings, how beautiful are the feet of those that preach the gospel of peace. And he writes, I never understood what the beauty of peace have to do with the gospel of peace. But now that I know, that I read your article, this is exactly the phrase that addresses you. And he encouraged him to continue that. And then in that letter, I want to read something from that letter, which I do not have here, but it is a remarkable thing here. He urges Einstein to oppose warmongers, to oppose capitalists. And he says, especially the British imperialists, whom I hate profoundly, who shed destruction in Palestine and in Java. Why they do it, the bloodthirsty, money and more oil-thirsty dog, you can best see from something else. My impression is that you should turn mainly against the British government, he tells Einstein. And what is more disgusting, as it calls itself the Labour government. Why? They are just as bad, listen to this, they are just as bad as the fat, cigar-smoking Winston Churchill, who moved 3,000 Greek patriots in Athens, the same people who mainly expelled the Hitlerites from Greece, and so on and so on. So this is Silberstein. So this, briefly, this is my account, yeah, in a telegraphic style of the story, the relations between these three heroes. And at the end, I would like to share with you a very personal story. In my view, a moving and interesting story, and in this setup, it's appropriate to share it. And it's a personal story about Leopold Infeldem. And yesterday, I met with his son, Professor Erich Infeldem, and I discussed with him. And he did not know all the details of this story. And I asked his permission to share with you what I am going to tell you. And I have his permission, otherwise I would not have done it. And you see, in his autobiography, in all the Wikipedia articles about Infeldem, it says that his first wife was Halina. But that's not true. There was a wife, Fanny Billig, with whom they lived several years, and as it sometimes happened, the marriage fell apart. But there was a boy, Richard Henrik. And Fanny took Richard Henrik and emigrated with him to Palestine. And there she met another immigrant from Warsaw, a Jewish, by the way, she was an outstanding teacher of physics and mathematics in Warsaw. And then she met this musicologist, the composer of music, who came from Warsaw, and they married. And he adopted Henrik Richard and raised him as Gil Edel. Edel is Yitzhak Edel, that's Richard. And he grew up, and he became one of the brightest students in the best gymnasium in Palestine at that time. His teachers referred to him as a genius in mathematics. Erich Infeldem told me yesterday that there is a letter from her to Leopold telling him that his son will be a greater mathematician than him. And he was, like the youth in those days, fighting for independence was in the patriotic mood. He was in the youth movement, he was in a kibbutz, and he joined a military underground organization, Palmach. And in his unit, a typhus epidemic broke up. And he died at the age of 1944. But his death did not go unnoticed. There are numerous memorial projects. There is a place in a kibbutz which has a library in his name. There is this sculptress who did a bust of him. There were numerous fellowships for excellent students in math and physics in his name. There was a cantata, a musical cantata composed until today is placed. There is in a memorial books. So you see, but in every one of these things, it is mentioned that he is the son of Leopold Infeld, who worked with Albert Einstein. And I was so thrilled and moved by this whole thing. This is the etiquette to this Sifria, this library in his name. So I asked a colleague of mine who has a radio program, does he know anything about it? So he knew a little bit, but he also was so impressed with this. So when I go home, I will appear on the radio and I will tell the whole story, and if Leopold Infeld will be remembered again. So this is the story that I wanted to share with you. And now, my final, believe me, is something about the Hebrew University. Einstein and the Hebrew University, and what you see here is, it's in the interior of the NASA space station, which is now orbiting the Earth. And the gentleman here is a flight engineer. There is a crew of 6, and Luca Parmitano is his name. And the European Space Agency has the mission every year to send an automated unmanned vehicle to dock with that space station, to bring equipment, to remove debris. Every year, they name this vehicle. There is one name. 2013, it was Albert Einstein. But in order to name this, they need our permission, because remember, we have the rights. So we agreed. And as in return, we were allowed to send some memorabilia to space that symbolize something. Luca Parmitano will sign them, then they will come back. As a kind of a gesture. And it was my mission to choose. And I chose 2 documents. And the 2 documents are these 2 documents. One is the first page of the manuscript of Einstein's masterpiece, The Foundation of General Relativity. I refer to this manuscript as the Magna Carta of Physics, the most sophisticated intellectual construction produced by a physicist's brain, a single physicist's brain. And the second document that I chose is a manifesto that Einstein wrote and published in the entire academic and Jewish press on the occasion of the opening of the Hebrew University in April 1925. So these 2, the universal and the particular, these 2 symbolize the 2 aspects of Einstein. The documents are still in space. They will return in June, and we will display them. Now, next year, 2015, the world will mark the 100th anniversary of general relativity. Everywhere there will be something. We shall emphasize these 2 aspects. It is appropriate that something is done also in Poland. And Poland has a very interesting story to tell. And to emphasize, it's not a generally known story. And that is the story of the reception of general relativity in Poland. Tak to w końcu końców, tak? To ta historia, którą wam dzisiaj opowiedziałem, to przede wszystkim to jest rozdział historii nauki, szczególnie historii teorii ogólnej względności. To jest też rozdział historyki fizyki w Polsce. I to jest też przypis do historii Żydów polskich. I te trzy elementy tego razem to robią coś takiego całego, coś specjalnego. Ja jestem bardzo wdzięczny, że ten muzeum wziął tą inicjatywę i mnie zaprosił, żeby to wszystko tutaj wygłosić. Toda raba.